First of all, I want to introduce Professor Piguet. Professor Piguet is professor at the Institute of Geography of the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. He chairs the Population Geography Commission of the International Geographical Union, IGU, and is vice president of the Swiss Federal Commission for Migration. He is specialized in migration studies with a focus on the migration-climate change nexus. He has written extensively on issues of migration flows, refugees, labor market integration of migrants, discrimination, statelessness, etc. He was review editor for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report, IPCC 2014, and has published numerous books and papers on the topic in scientific journals, including the Annals of American Association of Geographers, Population, Space and Place, Nature, Population and Development Review, Journal of Refugee Studies, etc. In December 2019, also he published a new book in French on asylum issues. So we have about 30 or between 30 or 40 minutes for your presentation. And after the presentation, we go for the questions and discussions. Thank you again, Professor Piguet, for being here. The ground is yours. You can start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. I'm very happy to be with you today. I'm sorry not to be physically present in Barcelona. It will be perhaps for another opportunity. I'm going to talk today about migration and climate change. I will start very, very far in the past with a quotation, but I'm going to go very fast to contemporary issues and even to future issues, as I will try to answer to the question, what do we know about the link between migration and climate change, and what can we expect in the future? So my quotation is from Tacitus, the Roman historian of the 1st century after Jesus Christ. And the quotation is the following: who would dare to leave Asia, Africa, or Italy to move to Germany, an horrible country with terrible landscapes, harsh climate, grim to live in, and to travel through? Of course, this quotation is funny considering the recent past and the number of migrants who are still attempting to reach Germany. But the reason why I'm interested in that quotation is that Tacitus is, to my knowledge, the first who mentioned explicitly climate, harsh climate, as a factor explaining migration, or here non-migration. And this is the beginning of an interest by theoreticians of migration of the impact of the climate, or more widely the natural environment, on the mobility of people. Of course, it has taken a long time before a real theory of migration emerged. But if you look at precisely those first theoreticians of migration during the 19th century, you will immediately realize that indeed the natural environment is very prominent in their views on migration. Just to mention three of them, Ratzel is very well known as one of the most famous geographers of the 19th century. For him, climate is one among two main drivers of migration in history. The other one being political turmoils. For Ratzel, either natural disasters or scarcity or political turmoils are the main drivers of population migration. A very different thinker of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is the very sympathetic Piotr Kropotkin. Sympathetic because he sees the future of humankind as a possible harmony and a possible world of cooperation and fraternity. He's an anarchist, Kropotkin. For him, in case of climate hazards and scarcening resources, migration is actually one among three social outcomes, possible social outcomes. The other social outcomes that are possible are conflicts. For example, if the climate deteriorates and scarcity of food emerge, people can compete and enter into conflicts, or part of the people can move elsewhere, or, that is the third social outcome for Kropotkin, cooperation and fraternity might emerge. It is very interesting to quote Kropotkin, and I'm probably gonna quote him again at the end of my presentation, because very often, still nowadays, one conceives the possible outcome of scarcity and environmental degradations only in terms of conflicts or migration. Whereas empirical research shows us that in some cases, water scarcity, for example, has driven different groups of people to cooperate, a very Kropotkinian outcome. The third person I wanted to mention is Ellen Churchill Semple. Ellen Churchill Semple was the first woman to chair the American Association of Geographers. And in 1911, she wrote actually, the search for better land, milder climate, and easier conditions of living starts many a movement of people. For Ellen Churchill Semple as well, the climate was a possible driver, either a push or a pull factor of migration. So the message behind those quotations is that definitely environmental and natural drivers were very present in the first attempt at theorizing migration. What is interesting and surprising is that to a large extent, it then disappeared during the 20th century from the views of the theoreticians of migration. If you look, and I'm sure some of you know those theories quite well, at the neoclassic theorization of migration, or among geographers at the behaviorist theories of the 1960s, or the neo-Marxist theories of migration, all those pillars of the theory of migration actually are not considering environmental drivers at all, for quite easy to explain reasons actually. First of all, during the first part and the middle of the 20th century, natural determinism was more and more criticized. Ellen Churchill Semple, for example, had very unfortunate theories about racial hierarchies linked to climatic differences. The idea that in warm countries, people were less smart, for example, was a typically deterministic idea of the beginning of the 20th century, which for good reason was then harshly criticized. But the criticism was so harsh as nearly to make even the idea of an impact of the natural environment on societies a taboo for geographers and for social scientists. So obviously this played a role in the disappearance of the natural environment in the explanation of migration. Another explanation has to do with the very actually Western Eurocentric idea that modernity implies a decreasing impact of nature on societies. You find a very good illustration of that in the work of Peterson. Peterson in 1958 wrote a very interesting typology of migrations. And in that typology, he has a specific category which he calls primitive migration. And primitive migration for Peterson are precisely the forms of migration that are produced by environmental drivers. But they are mainly features of the past or of what he calls still primitive societies, namely underdeveloped societies, to use the word of that period. And that shows us very well that the idea at that moment was that in more developed societies, nature had no more impact. In a sense, societies had mastered the impact of nature. So it was not very relevant anymore to look at possible impacts of the environment on those societies. And finally, a third explanation has to do with the fact that a very important field of inquiry developed after the Second World War along forced migration studies. But forced migration studies, which could have included migration connected to the environment, actually developed mainly around the political paradigm, namely states make refugees, not other drivers. And that's what actually is in the 1951 Convention on Refugees, which, as you might know, does not mention other drivers than political persecution for having to flee a country. So with those three explanations, I think we can understand quite well why the natural environment disappeared from the theories of migration during the 20th century. I'm not gonna go deeper into that issue. For those of you who might be interested in that intellectual history, I published quite a long time ago in 2013 a paper precisely entitled "From Primitive Migration to Climate Refugees" in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. But I thought it was important to say a few words about that history before really starting the core of my presentation. A core which is based on a second surprise, in a sense, after the disappearance of environmental drivers from migration studies. We witnessed at the end of the 20th century a reappearance of those drivers, of course, linked with the fear of climate change. And you can see this especially well in the 1980s with the famous Essam El-Hinawi, who in a report of the United Nations Environmental Programme coined, not really for the first time, but for the first time in such a prominent way, the term environmental refugees. Then other researchers, such as Norman Myers in Oxford during the 90s, also had quite significant production on that issue. A quotation from Norman Myers from 1997, for example: "The issue of environmental refugees promises to rank as one of the foremost human crises of our time." And Norman Myers also made some forecasts which were actually not based on any really solid methodology, but which are still sometimes reappearing in the medias, namely 150 million environmental refugees by the end of the 21st century. Of course, this renewed interest for the issue was linked to climate change. And here also you can see very well that things happened during the 1990s. The first IPCC report was published with that sentence: the gravest effects of climate change may be those on human migration, as millions will be displaced. That was the scientific part of the issue, but there is also a security part of the issue, because quickly security circles also raise a concern about possible migration linked to climate change. Here, for example, Javier Solana, the AU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy in 2008, such migration may increase conflicts in transit and destination areas. Europe must expect substantially increased migratory pressure. So in a sense, a context of fear around that issue. And of course, that context of renewed scientific interest on the one hand, of security fear on the other, raised the number of research which were produced on that topic. We have developed in Neuchâtel an exhaustive database of all scientific publications on the issue of migration and environmental change. And here on that graph, you can see the number of scientific publication each year on that topic. In red, you have case studies, empirical studies. In blue, you have the total of all publications, including methodological, theoretical, synthesis, etc. So what you very well can see on that graph is that starting in 1970, one had very, very few interests for that issue. Progressively, things are starting to change in the 1990s, and then suddenly in 2007, 2008, you have a huge increase in the number of publications, which actually coincide with citations and concerns such as the one I just mentioned from Javier Solana. So here you have an interesting example of an impact of the political context on scientific production. On the basis of this database, we can produce many kinds of analyses which are quite interesting to reconstruct the history of the field. If any of you are interested by this database, it is absolutely free, open access. Just send us a message and we will send us the database so that you can perform your own analysis. Again, it's a bibliographic database which gives a list of the publications with keywords which are made by ourselves, which are coherent and which allows to make some analysis. An example of the analysis that can be conducted with that database is about methodology. What are the methods which have been used to assess the link between migration and the environment? Well, mainly researchers are using qualitative methods, fieldwork, ethnographic methods, trying to understand why do people migrate, etc. But many case studies are also based on surveys or are identifying hotspots of vulnerability. What you have here are the percentages simply of the studies on using the different methods. But more and more also very sophisticated statistical analyses have developed on those issues. And recently, there is really an increase in such sophisticated analyses. There are also interesting historical analogs that are made, namely looking at past events, past links between migration and the environment in order to understand the processes. If you are interested in that specific methodological issue, I have just also published a paper in Wire's Climate Change on that topic. I take perhaps this opportunity to mention that, of course, the slides which I am using today will be accessible for you if you want to take note of the different informations that I give you. So that was, in a sense, the first part of my talk. We have gone into the history and the theories of migration. Now I'm going to be much more empirical, and I'm going to try to answer to the question of what do we know now about the climate drivers of human migrations, and can we get insights about the future impact of climate change. A good starting point for that inquiry are the work of IPCC, or to be more precise, the synthesis work of IPCC based on existing research. If we look at the last report of the IPCC, there are several impacts of climate change that are especially linked with possible migration. One can make a difference here between direct impacts and indirect impacts. Among direct impacts, I will focus on those who obviously are the most important, namely hurricanes and heavy rains. The forecast of the IPCC is that the intensity of those phenomena is going to increase, which of course leads to destructions of habitat, which then might lead to migration. Then the rise in temperatures, which has an impact on yields, for example. Decreasing yields are forecasted in many parts of the world. In some circumstances, droughts might destroy the whole availability of food, and obviously here again forecasts are that the severity of droughts is in the future. And finally, sea level rise is perhaps one of the most well-known consequences of climate change. It has a direct impact on habitats, and of course important populations are under threat. So we're going to go through those three aspects of climate change in a minute. I'm going to have less time to focus on indirect impacts. It must be said that they are, of course, more difficult to assess, but I will say a few words about the links between climate change that might lead to conflicts, that then might lead to migration, which might be a vicious circles leading to more conflicts. And just to mention, but I'm not gonna enter into that, one could also conceive of indirect impacts through health issues that might lead to migration, and which also could lead to other health issues. So let's go through those direct impacts, and let's take stock of what the existing case studies do say about the past experiences. In a sense, we are using here historical analogs to have an idea about the processes, and then to have an idea about possible future consequences of climate change. If we start with hurricanes, we have a bit of a surprise for a start, because if you look at the literature, you see that the link between such events and at least long-distance, long-term migration is rather weak. What is most often the case is that people do have to move after such events, but do not go very far. Victims are poor and not mobile in many, many countries of the world, especially in the countries which are the most threatened by hurricanes. If you think about Bangladesh, if you think about all the tropical areas, you will find peasant societies who are not or very often not in a position to move. The majority of the people also want to go back after such an event, reconstruct their village. The attachment to place is a very, very strong element. And it is a mistake to think that everybody will leave and will want to leave. Of course, there are cases when this happens, especially if a society is highly dependent on the environment, and this end is very important, if human action exacerbates the disaster. Even in rich countries like the United States, cases of hurricanes have had very different impacts on mobility and migration according to the way the policy were developed to address those issues. Take the example of Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina did lead to some important displacement of populations, and many populations which were displaced by Katrina actually were migrants in the sense that it was long-term migration. But it has a lot to do with the very, very important failures that were witnessed in the way assistance was given to the people hit by Katrina. And the reason why such migration took place has finally probably more to do with policies than with the natural environment alone. So this is a quite important thing to keep in mind. There is no direct, unequivocal link between the intensity of the disasters and the migration consequences of such disaster. So two messages at this stage. Key message one, displacements, yes, but mostly short term and short distance, so not really technically migration. Key message two, multi-causality. There is no natural disaster. There are always political, social, and natural disasters, and this should be kept in mind. Second phenomenon of interest, the temperature variability and droughts. Here, of course, we have some striking cases of desperate drought migration. If you look at the Sahel, for example, in the 1970s, you have cases of peasant populations that were hit by droughts, which had to move to cities or further internationally. And it's also true that there are very recent results based on sophisticated statistical analyses, which are documenting some links between migration to Europe, especially asylum migration, and temperature anomalies. So there is a link, but how strong is that link? How strong is that link in comparison with other drivers of migration? Obviously, the correlations, the partial correlations, if you want, which are specifically measuring that link, are weak in comparison with correlations with other drivers of migration. That's the first point. The second point is the same as I just made regarding hurricanes. Droughts and famine are man-made. Political and economic variables are more important in explaining their consequences than the natural environment alone. So this is not to say that there are no impacts, but this is to say that really multi-causality is here very prominent, and that one should be cautious when interpreting the consequences of natural environment degradation. Sometimes the relation is even reversed. In Mali, for example, the drought of the middle 80s has actually not increased but diminished long distance emigration, simply because families who had a regular migration relation with countries abroad, sending, for example, their eldest son to France or to Europe to work, suddenly had no more money to finance the trip. So that international migration actually decreased with adverse consequences for those families. What can be said on that basis and on the basis of the previous analysis is that there is no reasons to fear flows of climate refugees trying desperately to reach Europe. This is a fantasy. Most people who might be impacted by climate change will stay where they are or near where they are. Very few will attempt to move further. And this fear, which was very present, as I've shown you in some quotation of policymakers, is probably a bad counselor when thinking about appropriate policies. There is no automatic link between climate change and migration. What about conflicts? I mentioned that I'm going to say a few words about conflicts. Well, here again, the multi-causality is very prominent. It's true that some observers hold that the migration crisis of 2015 in Europe has an environmental component due, among others, to a vicious circle of droughts, conflicts, and migration. In Syria, it has been argued very prominently by some scholars. But the issue remains quite controversial. There are some correlation between temperature change and asylum, but again, they remain weak if you compare with other drivers. And obviously, if you look at the evolution of the political and the economic situation in Syria during the last 30 years, you must admit that Syrian refugees are not simply climate refugees. So that's very important to take into account. Again, without excluding the possibility of a contribution of the climate change to the migration drivers, but without over-interpreting it. This leads us back to key message 3, no reason to fear flows of climate refugees, but it's also true that climate change might act as a kind of threat multiplier in specific situations, and then it could indirectly lead to refugee flows. So that's what can be said of the two first direct possible drivers of migration. Now let's have a look at the third driver I mentioned, namely sea level rise. I'm just back a few weeks ago from fieldwork in Senegal, and here is a picture of the city of Saint-Louis. Saint-Louis is an old city in northern Senegal on the coastline with the Atlantic Ocean. And as you can see on this picture, part of the city is actually an island. This is the old city, an island on the fleuve Senegal, actually. The brown water, if you want, here is the Senegal River, who goes all along the coast before going to the ocean here. And here you have the Atlantic Ocean. Seeing this picture, you immediately what it would mean if we have a raising sea level from 1, 2, or 3 meters in the future. This part of the city, especially called the Langue de Barbarie, is about 1 meter or even less above sea level and is one of the most densely populated area in the world, with fishermen and many people depending on the sea for their livelihoods. So obviously, sea level rise is a major threat for populations. In that case, contrary to hurricanes and droughts, quite precise identification can be made of the areas under threat. And also, contrary to hurricane and droughts, this phenomenon is to a large extent irreversible. After a hurricane, you can come back and reconstruct. It's a very rapid phenomenon. Sea level rise is very slow, but irreversible. And localized previsions can be made of the number of persons under threat. That's what we have made a few years ago when we produced that map, which actually cross data on populations with data on elevation above sea level. What you have here is the number of people who are actually living in each country of the world below 10 meters above the sea. 10 meters might sound quite a lot, but actually, if you take into account all the processes which are associated with sea level rise, namely salinization, erosion, etc., you have to admit that probably that's the fair number of people who are under threat, even if sea level rise is only 1 or 2 meters, which is forecasted for the end of our century. As you can see, populations are under threat all over the world, but some regions are more populated than others. Southeast Asia, of course, China with the coastal cities, but also the Nile Delta in Egypt is very, very low, elevated above the sea. And also in Western countries, there are some regions which are not very high above the sea. For some populations, sea level rise might not only imply a loss of habitat, but also a lot of citizenship, especially small island states are under threat of being completely submerged by the sea. This is actually not the case of many island states, but I have tried in a paper a few years ago to produce an inventory, which leads to the conclusion that actually 5 island states are concerned, totalizing about 500,000 inhabitants: the Maldives, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and Kiribati. Of course, 500,000 inhabitants is a small number. It's a slim minority of the hundreds of millions of people who are threatened by sea level, as I just mentioned on the previous slide on the map. But at the same time, the inhabitants of those islands really exemplify to an extreme intensity the threat of fundamental right of citizenship of one part of humankind in connection with climate change. Meanwhile, even if those populations are definitely under a very serious threat, that does not necessarily mean migration, especially not long distance migration. In many cases, we have more to do with a necessity of displacement, namely 100, 200 meters. Of course, that might have severe consequences on the livelihoods of those populations, but this is not the same as considering those populations as future climate migrant or climate refugees. Besides this, the process is slow, as I mentioned. In some cases, adaptation are possible. In Senegal, where I took the picture I just showed you, there are important projects of dikes building, which could, during a certain period of time, prevent the population from having to migrate. Of course, this will not be sufficient, but this is also a way to say that there is no unavoidable link and mechanic link between climate change and migration. So protection measures can be efficient, but of course they are expensive. And if you remember the map I just showed you, I mentioned that there are also Western rich countries who have important populations living very near the sea. This is the case of the Netherlands, for example, by definition. And for centuries, the Netherlands have had a part of their population living even below the sea level. But the Netherlands have the financial means to build sophisticated dikes against the sea. That's why nobody actually fears flows of Netherlands citizens due to climate change to the rest of Europe. So the issue here has more to do with financial issues, economic issues, than really with the extent of the natural phenomenon. The number who will actually be displaced or forced to migrate will depend on the level of investment and planning, and of course on the level of the mitigation of climate change that we are able to implement. In that context, and that will be my last result, it is important to notice that among the very numerous case studies that we have synthesized in our database, many now are arguing that migration is not only a consequences of environmental change, but might also be a way to avoid severe consequences of climate change. In other words, migration can be the cure rather than the symptom of environmental degradation. Indeed, to come back to Senegal, we have witnessed in some areas under threat that the households who had migrants abroad were in a much better position to cope with environmental degradation, to implement changes in their resources, livelihoods, economic activities, than households who had no migrants among them. And this is very important because it shows us that migration can actually be a way to develop policies in order to face the bad consequences of climate change. This is also something which has been acknowledged by the IPCC. Already in 2014, you find that quotation in the report: expanding opportunities for mobility can reduce vulnerability. Changes in migration patterns can be responses to both extreme weather events and longer-term climate variability. So key message 6 and last key message of my talk: mobility can be the cure rather than the symptom. I think this is in a sense, an interesting reversal of the idea of migration that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, of really one of the bad consequences of climate change and environmental degradation. So I'm at the end of my presentation. I'm going to present some conclusions, and then we have some time for comments or questions from your side. First, range of conclusions around the possible forecasts of migration linked to climate change. First, it has to be acknowledged that climate change will negatively impact on populations livelihoods, especially on poor populations. Of course, I do not deny that at all. And combined with other factors, climate change in certain regions of the world might indeed trigger significant population displacements in the future. But most displacements will actually be internal rather than international, and short rather than long distance. In that context of multi-causality, any overall quantification of climate migrants, 150 million, 200 million, 1 billion, remains tricky and conceptually very fragile. If we turn now to more political conclusions, what can we say? Well, of course, the image of climate refugees or climate migrants might be useful. I do not deny that in order to convince of the necessity to convince populations and policymakers of the necessity to act against climate change, mentioning possible migration consequences in climate migrants is a good argument. But at the same time, it has to be kept in mind that stricto sensu, they are scientifically unfounded. There is no such thing as a pure climate refugee. You cannot try to identify a climate refugee. A climate refugee is also simultaneously, in 99% of the cases, somebody who has been the victim of bad policies, bad economic conditions, etc., etc. For that reason, policies and investment will ultimately determine the number of people who will be displaced. And in any case, climate change anxieties should not fuel the fears of floods of migration and support, as it does sometimes, anti-migration discourses and policies of closure. On the contrary, in certain circumstances, facilitating migration can be a way to face the very real challenges of climate change. And I come back to the beginning when I mentioned Kropotkin and his hope for a collaborative future. I think that the image of flows of climate refugees leads to fear. The idea that migration can be a part of the solution need to more cooperative strategies and policies, which probably are much more appropriate to address the issue. In any case, a collective research effort is necessary to forecast and plan these future challenges, and it's a very good sign that, as we witnessed on our graph, the number of case studies and people interested, just like you who are following that conference, by the issue is still growing. So thank you for having listened to that presentation, and I'm happy to comment or answer to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Piguet. We can add the questions in the comments so I can read them. If there are any questions from the audience. If no, I can ask my questions myself. So that's the first time I work with this platform. I hope I can find the chats correctly. It's here that Martin writes well.
Valeria just had a question. I gave her speaking rights if you want to speak yourself.
Okay, I go to ask my questions first. For my first question is, as you said, putting the emphasis on climate change and migration in both in media and also some scientific researchers is a way for policymakers for securitization and putting pressure on migrants to keep them in their origins and strengthen the borders. But on the other hand, when they want to talk about the protection of people who was displaced dominantly by climate change, they use terms like, for example, mixed migration or something like that, which the reason why people migrate is ambiguous. And since under international law principles, the reason why people leave their homes is crucial to accord them certain rights, how do you explain this duality and what is the role of us as a researcher? And another question is, when we have a look at the papers investigating the effect of climate change on migration, they are mostly about the effect of climate change, as you said, on political conflict, on livelihoods, on social conflict. But there are few papers about, for example, at least I haven't seen a lot, on demographic drivers like, for example, health issues, as there are many, since there are many evidences that health issues like heat waves, floods, and etc. affect people's health physically and mentally. And also cultural drivers, like, for example, Aboriginal people in Australia, in African tribes, their lives, their ceremonies are very dependent on water. So my question is it possible is it a suitable approach just investigate effect of climate change just on one or two drivers of migration, as we believe all these drivers interact with each other and let people decide to migrate or don't? Especially in the interdisciplinary era, it is sometimes very hard to separate some of these political, social, etc. drivers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these two excellent questions. To start with the issue of protection, as you mentioned, and as I also briefly mentioned at the beginning of my talk, there is no provision in the international law regarding people who might have to move due to either environmental change or any other environmental degradation. So some people have argued for simply including those motives of migration within the refugee conventions. At the same time, UNHCR, for example, has been very cautious about such an idea. And this is indeed a difficult issue because as one can witness already today, it is very difficult to properly implement the relatively narrow definition of refugees that we have. So what would happen if this definition was broadened? Would this really bring more protection to the people, or would this bring even more fears among already not very welcoming countries regarding those migrants? So I think that because it is such a multi-causal phenomenon on the one hand, also because it is probably pragmatically impossible to really imagine that the refugee convention could be enlarged, I think this is not the main solution that we should seek for. I see much more potential at the local level there are some regional conventions on refugees which do mention the environment as a possible driver. And more generally, I think that improving emergency assistance in case of sudden environmental disasters, improving international cooperation regarding slow onset phenomenon such as sea level rise is a much more important and efficient way to protect the highest possible numbers of people. But for that, we need to recognize also the level of responsibility which is which the developed countries have, of course, regarding climate change, to improve solidarity funds, for example, to address loss and damages linked to climate change. There are negotiations on the way on that issue. They are not easy, but I really hope that they will include the population issues as much as possible. Another interesting instrument is soft law. Rather than trying to have a convention on environmental refugees, which is probably unrealistic, one could try to develop best practices commitment by countries regarding displacements linked to environmental degradation. This is already the case through the so-called Platform on Disaster Displacements, which is an organization based in Geneva, who has been able to develop a very impressive code of good practice and very impressive commitment by a significant number of countries to respect those good practices in case of displacements through their borders. And I think that's a promising, that's a slow process, but that's a promising development. So that's what I wanted to say regarding the first issue. Then regarding the second issue, I fully agree that there are some aspects of those complex links that we have described that are under research. You have pointed at health issue. That's definitely the case. If you look at our database, you will find keywords which precisely allow to make a kind of mapping, not only geographically, but also thematically, of existing research, and there are obviously blind spots. But a part of calling for more case studies and more research on that topics, I think we also need probably a paradigmatic shift, in the sense that we should theoretically address the issue of the links between the environment and migration, not as a specific subfield, but we should re-embed this issue within mainstream migration theories, which are taking into account power relations, political economy. We should consider the driver as one among others in interaction with others, and we should also develop theorization linked with that embeddedness. And that's something which has started not so long ago, and which is also promising. It is necessary in order precisely to avoid, as you have mentioned, to try to focus on one single driver, because if you try to focus on one single driver, then the only conclusion that you can have is that there is multi-causality, so that the driver cannot be really properly assessed. So so I think this is a development which is actually in the making, and which is promising.
Thank you so much. Very impressive. Continue. Rahel asks, what link do you see between climate migration and neo-colonialist power relations?
It's a very important issue, and obviously there have been links from the beginning. When the topic reappeared on the agenda, as I mentioned, during the 1980s, it was really impregnated with a neo-colonial gaze, if you want, which is obvious if you look, for example, at the pictures which were used at that time and which are still used to, in a sense, describe so-called climate refugees. Climate refugees are always, or very often, people from tropical regions, which are very often, these are women, they are dressed in bright colors, and they have waters up to their knees, and that's the way those people are described. But this is, of course, as has been described by many post-colonial researchers, a form of racialization of the climate refugees. The climate refugees is not a Dutch white man. The climate refugees is a dark-skinned person from tropical regions, which, of course, might be true because certain regions are more vulnerable than others, but at the same time, considering the physical characteristics of the environment, the Netherlands are under threat as much as northern Senegal. Simply, the Netherlands has more money to address those issues. So this I think is a very important point, which to a certain extent has been very interestingly addressed by some researchers, but which still deserve quite a lot of investigations.
Thank you. Valeria Bello want to ask a question. Hello, Valeria. Continue.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So first of all, let me thank Professor Piguet for his talk, which has been extremely, of course, excellent, and it is a privilege indeed to listen to your research, because your research has definitely been an asset in the field of migration and climate change, which, as you have reminded today, has not been so much investigated, particularly in the past, and now finally we see some development in this area, although there are all the issues that you've mentioned, which make the situation a complex analysis, for the reason, as you said, of the embeddedness with all other elements and drivers of migration. So I have to, so thank you also to IBEI for organizing this great talk. What I wanted to ask you is, because I actually agree very much with you on most of the issues you've raised, and particularly the fact that migration can be a cure rather than the symptom of climate change. But on the other side, there is this evident difficulty for particularly vulnerable persons and vulnerable categories within states and within areas, even at local level. There are specific segments of the societies that suffer the most the consequences of climate change. and they often go along a journey of migration that first is internal as a sort of displacement, as you were mentioning before, and only after that they can become international migrants. And in this sense, what I wanted to ask you is how much the situation of recognizing climate migration, keeping into account that I agree with you that there are also other drivers and sometimes there are intervening factors, but how much of this recognition of the topic of migration also depends on the responsibility of states, in the sense that the responsibility for climate change is not one that can be clearly identified as a single responsibility of states, and it's a sort of shared responsibility. Particularly, we have seen that climate change is, of course, due to the industry and the unsustainable exploitment of the environment, but the consequences of climate change are paid mostly by those countries and those segments of the societies that enjoy the less the production. And therefore there are all these connections. What do you think there will ever be a different outcome in managing migration, and particularly when it comes to climate migration? Because of this, is there a hope that there is this acknowledgement of the responsibility of states at the global level? And also on the other side, what is the effect of the fact that migration is not recognized even by those who suffer of the consequences of climate change? They also sometimes don't recognize themselves as environmental or climate migrants. We have seen this in a research that we developed in 2015 in the Pacific Islands, as these are the lands, unfortunately, that suffered the most because of climate change, both for sea level rise, but also for the disruption it has on the possibility of yielding, and the fresh waters who become salty. So the Pacific Islands are definitely amongst the countries that suffer the most the consequences of climate change. And despite this, those persons who were forced to leave their islands and to find better living standards somewhere else, they do not recognize themselves as climate refugees or as climate migrants, and even they do not want to be recognized as such, because possibly other refugee statuses are less complicated to claim in other countries. It is true there have been a couple of situations in which if I'm not wrong, I don't remember if it was Australia or New Zealand. I think it was New Zealand that recognized some refugees because of climate reasons under the clause of the humanitarian clause of the Refugee Convention. But this is evidently an exception. So what do you think? What is the future? What can we expect from all of this? Well, of course, thank you so much for sharing also the information on the database. I will definitely ask if I can access it for my research. Thank you so much. And I'm Valeria Bello from IBEI. I'm a adjunct professor at IBEI and associate professor at Blanquerna University here in Barcelona. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for all these comments. And of course, regarding the database, you are welcome. We will send it to you with pleasure. Well, you have raised many very, very interesting and important issues. And I'm perhaps going to comment on most of them one after the other, and probably not on all of them. But I think perhaps first regarding what you mentioned as a possible step-by-step process. This is something which is definitely under research, namely population might have to move short distance, but then them or others might have to move longer distance, etc. A kind of chain migration. This is not easy to address as an issue. And what we would need, and probably that's a development for the future, is long-term panel data where people could be questioned every year or every 2 years during a long period, in order precisely to better understand those chain migration processes. That's a methodological comment, but I think here there is really something which could be developed. Then perhaps regarding the issue of the responsibility of the states or other entities as well, it's of course extremely difficult and nearly impossible to quantify responsibility and then to implement some compensation measures. But at the same time, I think that regarding climate change, the link between CO2 emission and climate warming is much more obvious and strongly scientifically documented than any past link of responsibility regarding other phenomena. Take, for example, the impacts of colonialism. Of course, colonialism has had huge negative impacts in many regions of the world. Everybody, or nearly everybody, can agree on that, but it would be completely impossible to even think about the quantification. Regarding climate change, to a certain extent, and there are some interesting research in that domain, there could be some quantifications of the responsibilities based on simply historical record of CO2 emissions. Of course, it can be criticized as well, but I read a few years ago a stimulating, I would say, paper which had explicitly made a calculation of the proportion of people who should be either protected on site or welcomed as migrants by the different countries of the world in proportion to their historical records of CO2 emission. It was an attempt at quantifying that responsibility. Of course, again, it's more of a game of the mind, but nevertheless, we are in a situation where I think that some negotiations, some recognition are possible and could lead to probably not quotas of refugees, because this raised the question of who are the climate migrants, which I addressed in my talk, but at least regarding a contribution to climate funds to address the consequences of climate change, this could be a help, to try to work on this issue of responsibility. Then perhaps the last point I want to address is there any hope of some policy developments regarding the protection of the victims of climate change? And I think that, as I mentioned, I do not believe that it's conceivable to amend the 1951 convention, but definitely I think that, and also I don't think that it is conceivable to implement an open border policy, for example, which would be a way to to harness migration as a tool precisely to improve not only the answer to climate change, but also development as a whole. It's obviously not realistic currently, but progressively, I think that there are many forms of either local agreements regarding specifically the mobility of people impacted by climate change. As I mentioned, it is in some regional conventions. I saw that in the chat that somebody wanted to know more about that. So I take the opportunity to mention the African Union Convention, which explicitly mentioned the environment, and also the so-called Cartagena Convention, which is not really an international law instrument, but which is an agreement between countries of Latin America, who also mentioned the issue of migration linked to the climate. So there are some attempts at setting up regional conventions, and also more broadly, there are attempts at building regional open border policies. And this is much more realistic probably than trying to implement a world open border policy immediately. And if you look at the recent past, the level of liberty of mobility within some regional areas has increased, not only in Europe with the European Union, but also in Western Africa, for example, in Southern America. And I think through those regional migration agreements, there is a way to indirectly address the issue of climate change, because as I mentioned in my talk, and as you mentioned in your question, mobility can really be a form of answer to those issues. So I think at that regional level, also because those processes are slow, fortunately, climate change will really be felt not within 2 or 3 years, but within 10, 20, 50 or 100 years. So one could hope that within that time frame, the level of political limitation on migration might decrease. I'm optimistic here. Perhaps I shouldn't, but and that could be an answer. I also believe that some specific bilateral agreements could be an answer. I think, for example, about countries who had been linked by historical migration contacts and who might now implement, also considering that migration is needed in many countries for demographic reasons, might implement specific channels of migration in the future. And I think that will not be the solution to climate change, but that could be really a contribution to face this issue.
Thank you. Aida Casanovas asked, thank you very much for your lecture. Is it the first time on migration and climate change that we have? And it was very interesting. I would like to know if you could recommend any reference on empirical evidence on of the influence of climate change on migration or displacement in the Mediterranean region.
So maybe I can give a few additional information on that issue. I take this opportunity because in our bibliographic database, precisely, we have implemented regional keywords. And this means that all case studies which are dealing, for example, with specific regions can be easily identified, which might be an asset for people who are interested in specific regions.
Okay. Next question by Anna Maria. Thank you very much. Which are the regional conventions mentioning climate as a driver that you were commenting upon?
Well, these are mainly the two I mentioned, namely the African Union and the Cartagena Declaration. And beside this, should not be forgotten the work of the Platform on Disaster Displacements, which has also produced not conventions but best practices, which are then endorsed by a significant number of countries.
Great. Martina Sardo, I found the professor focused on the role of cooperation super interesting. I was wondering if it was a consideration linked only to local regional governance, or are there hopes, in your opinion, of implementing a global cooperation that until now seems to be very weak, at least according to me? What could be the potential of the international level?
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I mentioned in my answer to the previous previous question, I'm more optimistic, at least in the first phase, regarding local and regional cooperation. I think in regarding migration issues, it's really currently very difficult to implement binding improvements at a global level. Of course, there are some attempts at going to that direction. I think the Global Compact on Migration, respectively, the Global Compact on the Refugees, are interesting attempts at trying to act at world level. But if you look in detail at what is the content of those global compacts, you must admit that they are not binding at all, and that in fact they are very general and not really making a big difference with the current situation. So I think it is still very important to act at multilateral global level, but the process is very, very slow. Whereas at more local level, I think there are interesting developments which are more innovative in a sense.
We have one more comment. Do you think there is probability that the West or economic developed countries will invest in policies in poor countries to mitigate the effects of climate change? Or in which ways does this occur? I was thinking that this would not happen so quickly, but on the other hand, it could be done as a way to prevent migration to Europe if eventually international migration would be inescapable.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it shows the complexity of the way we argue about those issues. Because I agree with you that to a large extent there are no incentives for rich countries to invest where the consequences of climate change are the worst. And in that context, it could be a good argument to convince them to connect those issues with possible flows of migrants. And in that sense, again, as a tool for policy lobbying, I think the image of the climate refugees is perfectly usable. Whereas scientifically, I must, as I have done today, point at the multi-causality. So there are like of two different gremiums, two different scenes where of course the issue is labeled quite differently for quite different reasons. But in that context, I think that of course the generosity of a rich country is always interested by positive consequences. So it's a calculated generosity, and one cannot be very optimistic if one look at the past. But I still think that, and again I could quote Kropotkin here, is that regarding climate change, really, even if more vulnerable countries are at the forefront and poor countries are at the forefront, all countries really have an objective interest to really act as quickly as possible in order to mitigate not only the consequences, but of course also the causes of climate change. And one can see some signs that this also comes to the minds of high-level policymakers. They are not only completely hypocritical, and the case of the area of Saint-Louis in Senegal is a good illustration. I think there is really a commitment by France, but also by other countries and by the World Bank, to try to protect that area with a dike, which is only very indirectly in the interest of those donors. So they can be some initiatives which are going into the right direction, and I do not lose completely hope in that context. But it's true that the fear of migration has probably contributed also to that commitment of the donor's country, because precisely the area of northern Senegal is one of the departure zones for undocumented migration for now quite a long time.
Thank you so much. Is there any more questions? Mark, for us, or someone else? Okay. I think there is no more questions, so we can close the session. Thank you again, Professor Piguet, I combine my Spanish with English, sorry, for participating in our session. Very impressive, very interesting presentation. And thank to the audience. Thank you so much. I will close the session. Have a good time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.